Every Easter, the same argument shows up online. Someone posts it, it gets shared 1,000 times, and suddenly Christians everywhere are scrambling for a calculator. The argument goes like this: Jesus died on Friday and rose on Sunday. That is not 3 days. That is barely 36 hours. And most people who try to answer it get lost counting sunsets and Hebrew idioms and end up more confused than when they started. But here is the thing. That whole argument is aimed at the wrong target. The real question was never about counting hours. The real question is this: why does the number 3 keep showing up in this story long before Jesus ever walked toward a tomb? Because it does. Over and over. In places most people have never looked. Scholars who study this have actually given it a name, the third-day motif. And it does not appear once or twice. It threads through the Old Testament, through the Gospels, through the letters of Paul, across more than a dozen key texts spanning nearly 2,000 years. Most of us were taught the resurrection as a single event, something that happened on a Sunday morning. But nobody showed us the architecture underneath it. Nobody pulled back the curtain to reveal a pattern that had been quietly building since the days of Abraham. That is exactly what we are going to do today. We are going to trace every major appearance of the number 3 in the resurrection story. And by the end, you will not see it as a math problem. You will see it as a fingerprint. Picture Jerusalem on the week Jesus died. Not the quiet, painted version from a church wall. The real one. It is Passover week in the year 30 AD. The city normally holds around 30,000 people. But by the time the week arrives, nearly 200,000 pilgrims have flooded in from across the Roman world. Every road into the city is packed. Every spare room is rented. The markets are loud and overcrowded. Roman soldiers stand doubled at the gates, watching the crowd the way you watch a fire you are not sure you can control. And in the temple, the priests are working without stopping. Thousands of lambs are being brought in, examined, and slaughtered for the Passover meal. The courtyards run red. The smell of blood hangs over the entire city like a low cloud. This is the world Jesus died in. Now here is the detail almost nobody talks about. Jewish law was very specific about one thing. A body could not remain unburied after sundown on the day of death. It was not a tradition. It was a legal requirement. So when Jesus died in the mid-afternoon, his followers had only a few hours to get permission from Pilate, take the body down from the cross, wrap it properly, and seal it in a tomb. They made it, but barely, and then the sun went down. The disciples did not gather in some grand hall to mourn together. They were hiding, crammed into a borrowed upper room in a city that had just screamed for their teacher's execution. The same religious leaders who arranged the crucifixion were still out there. The same crowds were still in the streets. Peter, who had already denied knowing Jesus 3 times the night before, was sitting in that room too, afraid, ashamed, trying to understand how everything had collapsed so completely. But here is what makes this moment so important. Somewhere in that locked room, at least some of them remembered something Jesus had said. Not once, not twice, 3 separate times during his ministry, he had told them clearly, "The Son of Man will be handed over, killed, and after 3 days he will rise." 3 times. And every time he said it, they had missed it. They argued, they changed the subject, they asked about thrones and greatness instead. They had heard the promise 3 times and still did not believe it was real. And neither did his enemies. Which is exactly why the chief priests went to Pilate the very next morning and asked for armed guards at the tomb. They remembered the prediction even if the disciples had stopped thinking about it. They wanted that tomb locked and watched for 3 days. Nobody on either side fully understood what 3 days meant. But the number was already in motion. So where did the 3 days come from? Was it just something Jesus said? Or was he reaching back into something much older? It goes back much further than most people realize. In the Hebrew language, the phrase translated as "on the 3rd day" is bayom hashlishi, and it appears over 40 times in the Old Testament. 40 times. That is not a coincidence, and it is not casual. In the way Hebrew storytellers structured their writing, the 3rd day carried a very specific meaning. It was the day of divine resolution, the day when human crisis had reached its absolute peak, and then God moved. 2 days of waiting, of darkness, of not knowing. And then on the third day, everything changed. This pattern shows up so consistently that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But the clearest example, the one that should stop you completely, is Genesis 22. Abraham is told to take his son Isaac, his only son, the child of the promise, the one he had waited decades for, and offer him as a sacrifice on a mountain called Moriah. So Abraham and Isaac begin walking. Day 1 passes, day 2 passes, and then the text says something remarkable. On the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place in the distance. The third day, right on schedule, Abraham raises the knife, and then God stops him. A substitute appears, a ram caught in a thicket nearby. Isaac is returned to his father alive. The son who was as good as dead came back on the third day. Paul knew exactly what this story meant. In Hebrews 11 verse 19, he writes that Abraham received Isaac back from the dead, and he uses the words, as in a resurrection. Paul was not stretching the text. He was reading it the way it was always meant to be read. The resurrection pattern was not invented in the New Testament. It was encoded into the founding story of the Jewish people 2,000 years before the empty tomb existed. And then there is Hosea, a prophet who lived 700 years before Jesus wrote these words in Hosea 6 verse 2. After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will restore us, so that we may live in his presence. Hosea was not writing about Jesus. He could not have been. But when Paul sits down in 1 Corinthians 15 to write the earliest and most important summary of the resurrection, he says Jesus rose on the third day according to the Scriptures. Not according to eyewitness accounts alone. According to the Scriptures. Hosea is one of the texts he is pointing at. The resurrection was not announced and then explained afterward. It was predicted in the very grammar of the Hebrew Bible for centuries before it happened. The moment you see that, everything shifts. What happened in that garden on the third day was not random. It was the landing of a promise that had been in the air for a very long time. Now let us trace the number 3 through the resurrection story itself. Because once you start looking, it is everywhere. And each appearance is doing something specific. The first place to look is Mark's Gospel. Jesus announces his own death and resurrection not once, but 3 times. You find them in Mark 8, Mark 9, and Mark 10. 3 separate moments. 3 clear warnings. And each time he says it, the disciples respond in a way that is almost painful to read. The first time, Peter pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him. The second time, the disciples are busy arguing among themselves about who is the greatest. The third time, James and John use the moment to ask for the best seats in the kingdom. Jesus is telling them he is going to die and come back, and they are thinking about power and position. But notice what happens with each prediction. They get more specific. By the third one, Jesus names the city Jerusalem. He says he will be handed to the Gentiles. He says he will be mocked, flogged, and killed. And on the third day he will rise. It is not vague anymore. It is a detailed forecast. And they still did not grasp it. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a picture of how hard it is for the human mind to accept something it has never seen before. They heard the words. The words just could not find anywhere to land. The second appearance of 3 comes during the crucifixion itself. Luke 23 verse 44 tells us that from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the whole land. 3 hours of total darkness in the middle of the day. Some people try to explain this as an eclipse, but that is not possible. Passover always falls on a full moon, and solar eclipses cannot happen during a full moon. This darkness was not natural. And any Jewish reader in the first century would have felt a deep chill reading about it, because they knew their history. The 9th plague God sent over Egypt before the original Passover was 3 days of darkness. 3 days before the first Passover lamb was killed. Now 3 hours of darkness fell before the true Passover lamb died. The detail is not decoration. It is a deliberate echo placed inside the story for those with eyes to see it. The third appearance involves a man most people think they already understand. Peter. On the night Jesus was arrested, Peter followed at a distance to the courtyard of the high priest. It was cold. Someone had lit a charcoal fire, and people were standing around it warming themselves. 3 different people recognized Peter as a follower of Jesus. 3 times he was asked. 3 times he said no. The 3rd time, a rooster crowed. Jesus turned and looked at him from across the courtyard, and Peter walked out and wept. 3 denials. 1 for each year he had followed Jesus. Now jump forward to John 21, after the resurrection. Jesus appears to the disciples on a beach. There is another charcoal fire, the only other time that specific detail appears in John's Gospel. And Jesus turns to Peter and asks him a question. Do you love me? Peter says yes. Jesus asks again. Do you love me? Peter says yes again. Jesus asks a 3rd time, and Peter is hurt by the 3rd asking, because he understands exactly what is happening. 3 questions. 3 answers. 3 commissions. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. The 3 denials are not simply forgiven. They are replaced, overwritten point by point, with 3 moments of restoration on a beach by a fire. The number 3 broke Peter, and the number 3 put him back together. That is not coincidence. That is a God who is precise. The 4th appearance takes us to the tomb itself. Mark 16 verse 1 names the women who came to the tomb on that first morning. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, 3 women. They are the first to arrive. They are the first to see the stone rolled away. They are the first to hear the announcement that Jesus has risen. Here is what makes this extraordinary. In 1st century Jewish culture, women were not accepted as legal witnesses in a court of law. Their testimony carried no official weight. If someone wanted to invent a story about an empty tomb and make it as believable as possible, they would never choose 3 women as the first witnesses. They would choose respected men, leaders, people with credibility. The fact that every gospel account names women as the first witnesses at the tomb is one of the most honest details in the entire story. Nobody fabricates the kind of evidence that works against them. The 5th appearance takes us somewhere most people do not expect. In Matthew 12 verse 40, a group of religious leaders demand that Jesus prove himself with a miraculous sign. His answer is this: the only sign you will be given is the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus is not reaching for a dramatic illustration. He is pointing at the one story in the entire Hebrew Bible that most precisely maps onto what is about to happen to him. A man swallowed by darkness, 3 days of silence, then thrown out alive onto dry ground. Jonah did not want to carry his message. He ran from it, and yet his biography became a container for the shape of the gospel. And then there is one final appearance of 3 that most people miss entirely. The Pharisees go to Pilate and ask him to secure the tomb. For how long? 3 days. They quote Jesus' own words back to Pilate. They remember the prediction better than the disciples do. Pilate sends guards. The stone is sealed. Armed soldiers stand watch. Every human effort to prevent the 3rd day ends up pointing directly at it. If you are seeing the Bible as something carefully built, not just a collection of old stories, but an actual architecture with a plan underneath it, in a way nobody ever showed you before, the best thing you can do right now is help someone else find this. Subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a comment with the detail that hit you hardest. And share this with one person who thinks the resurrection is just an Easter tradition. Even one share matters more than you know. Now let me show you something most people walk right past, because the number 3 does not stop at the tomb. Most people think the Gospels are the earliest written records we have of the resurrection. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But that is not actually true. The earliest written account of the resurrection is found in a letter, 1 Corinthians 15. And Paul wrote it at least a decade before any of the 4 Gospels existed in their final form. In that letter, Paul does something careful and deliberate. He lists the appearances of the risen Jesus one by one. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12 disciples, then to more than 500 people at the same time, and Paul notes that most of them are still alive when he is writing, meaning anyone who doubts can go and ask them directly. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And then Paul says, he appeared to me also. Scholars who study ancient Jewish legal tradition have pointed out that this list is not random. It follows the same structure used in Jewish courts to establish that something really happened. Multiple witnesses across multiple separate occasions with names attached. Paul is not writing poetry. He is building a legal case. But here is the part that most people read straight past. Tucked inside verse 4, almost as if it is obvious, Paul writes that Jesus was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. For words that carry enormous weight. According to the Scriptures. Paul is not saying the third day was a surprise that everyone figured out after Easter morning. He is saying it matched something that was already written, already known, already expected by anyone who had been reading carefully. And here is what makes this even more significant. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians within 3 to 5 years of the resurrection itself. But most scholars believe the specific words he uses in verses 3 and 4 are even older than the letter. The language has the shape of a creed, a short, memorized statement that believers repeated together. Something you could teach a new believer in their first week. Something simple enough to carry in your memory before you owned a single written text. Which means the third day was not a theological idea that developed slowly over years of study and debate. It was the first thing the earliest Christians put into words. It was Article 1, the opening line of the oldest summary of the faith we have. Think about what that means. Within just a few years of the empty tomb, communities of believers scattered across the Roman world were already reciting together that Jesus rose on the third day according to the Scriptures. Not as a new discovery, not as something they had recently worked out, but as the fulfillment of a pattern the Hebrew Scriptures had been carrying for 1,000 years. They were not reporting a surprise. They were announcing an arrival. The third day had been written into Abraham's story. It had been spoken through Hosea. It had been lived out in the darkness of Jonah's 3 days in the deep. And now it had happened, exactly as the pattern said it would. Exactly on schedule. The early church did not look at the empty tomb and then search the Scriptures to find an explanation. They looked at the Scriptures and recognized that what had always been promised had finally, completely, and precisely come true. So pull back for a moment and look at everything together. Because when you lay it all out in a single line, what you see is not a collection of interesting details. You see a construction. It starts with Abraham. 2,000 years before the empty tomb, a father walks toward a mountain with his only son. On the third day he raises the knife. A substitute appears. The son comes back alive. Paul later calls it a resurrection. 700 years before Jesus, the prophet Hosea writes that after 2 days God will revive his people, and on the third day he will restore them so they can live in his presence. He is not writing about Jesus by name, but he is writing in the exact pattern that will one day describe him. Then comes Jonah, a reluctant prophet swallowed into darkness. 3 days of silence inside something that should have killed him, then thrown out alive onto dry ground. And Jesus himself points at this story and says, "This is the sign. This is the one picture I will give you of what is coming." Then the third day arrives. Jesus rises. And Paul writes within just a few years that this happened according to the Scriptures. Not despite anyone's expectations. Not as a shock that required new theology to explain. According to what was already written. According to the pattern that had been building across 1,500 years and multiple authors who never met each other. That line from Abraham to Hosea to Jonah to the empty tomb is not coincidence. Coincidence does not hold its shape across 15 centuries. That line is intentional construction. And then there is Peter. We watched him deny Jesus 3 times beside a charcoal fire in a cold courtyard. We watched him walk out weeping. Now jump forward 50 days to the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. Peter is standing in Jerusalem, the same city, many of the same people in the crowd who had called for the crucifixion weeks earlier. And Peter stands up and preaches the resurrection out loud, in public, with his full name behind every word. The man who could not admit to a servant girl that he knew Jesus is now staking his life on the empty tomb. In the city where it happened. In front of people who could have him arrested before sunset. Something changed Peter during those 3 days. Something changed him so completely that the rest of his life pointed in only one direction. Which brings us to the present tense. Because the number 3 in this story is not a puzzle for scholars or a talking point for Easter sermons. It is a signal placed inside the text for every reader in every century. A signal that says this was not accidental. This was not managed after the fact. This was planned. Peter himself writes in his first letter that Jesus was chosen before the creation of the world. The architecture was not built around the event. The event was built around the architecture. He is not simply a historical figure who survived death and surprised everyone. He is the answer to a question the entire Old Testament had been asking for a very long time. And the third day was always the moment the answer was going to arrive. So what do you do with all of this? Because information about the Bible is everywhere. What matters is what you carry with you when the video ends. Here is the first thing worth carrying. Peter denied Jesus 3 times beside a fire. And Jesus did not simply forgive that and move on. He went back to the exact number. 3 questions on a beach. 3 commissions. 3 moments of restoration to replace 3 moments of failure. The God of the resurrection does not just wipe the record clean. He goes back to the specific wound and heals it specifically. If you are carrying something you are ashamed of, and if you can count it, if it has a number attached to it, this pattern is speaking directly to you. Not in a general, everything will be fine way. In a precise, point-by-point way. The same God who met Peter's 3 denials with 3 restorations is not finished with the details of your story either. Here is the second thing worth carrying. The first people to hear that Jesus had risen were 3 women whose testimony meant nothing in a court of law. They had no credentials, no platform, no official standing. And yet the angel at the tomb did not wait for someone more qualified to show up. The first announcement of the most important event in human history was made to people the world would have overlooked completely. Whoever told you that you are not the right person to carry this story, whoever made you feel too small or too broken or too unknown, the text does not agree with them. It never did. Now imagine something with me. Picture a room somewhere in the Roman world. 30 years after the resurrection. A small group of people meeting in someone's home. And someone stands up and begins to recite the words Paul wrote. He was buried. He was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Somewhere in that room is a person who grew up hearing the story of Abraham and Isaac. Who sat through readings of Jonah as a child. Who once heard a teacher read from Hosea, after 2 days he will revive us, and on the 3rd day he will restore us. Those pieces had always felt separate. Interesting, maybe, but disconnected. And then in that moment, listening to those words, something happens. Every fragment clicks into place, like a photograph slowly coming into focus. What had seemed like scattered stories from an ancient library was actually one long sentence. And they had just heard the final word. That is what the number 3 was always pointing to. Not a counting problem, not a calendar debate, a completed promise. A fingerprint left across 1,500 years of scripture that could only belong to one person. If this opens something for you today, subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. We are going deeper into the patterns most people were never shown. Leave a comment with the moment that stopped you. I read everyone. And share this with someone who grew up hearing these stories but was never handed the architecture underneath them. That is genuinely how this content reaches the people who need it most. Please keep us in your prayers as we keep making this. It means more than you know. God bless you.